Somewhere in a research office in 2014, a team led by geneticist Katarzyna Bryc sat with results pulled from over 160,000 genotyped Americans, the kind of sample size that turns a hunch into a fact. The screen in front of them held a number nobody found particularly surprising at first. African American ancestry, averaged across the sample, came back at 73.2% African and 24.0% European. On its own, that's a familiar story, one most people could have guessed the shape of even without a lab. What actually stopped the room was the mirror image of that number. Self-identified white Americans, especially across the South, were carrying African ancestry in measurable amounts. Not as some rare exception, but as a pattern. In South Carolina, the figure sitting on screen read close to 13% of self-identified white residents carrying African ancestry. That's not a rounding error. That's a state's self-understanding running into contradiction with its own genome. None of this came from a leak or a whistleblower. It ran in the American Journal of Human Genetics, peer-reviewed, fully public, sitting in an archive anyone could search. The shocking part was never that someone hid it. The shocking part is what a single number does once it's set next to the story a country tells about who belongs in which category, and how those categories came to be. What does it mean when a country's genome quietly disagrees with its own history books? A textbook can describe two populations as separate. A courtroom can enforce that separation with law. But a genotyping array doesn't read textbooks or courtrooms. It just reads DNA. And DNA in the American South spent centuries refusing to observe the boundary anyone tried to draw around it. This isn't a leak. It's sitting in a public journal, cited, indexed, available to anyone with library access, and almost nobody outside genetics ever read it. The data has been public for over a decade. The story it tells has not caught up. If you're the kind of person who wants the DNA story under the headline instead of the headline itself, that's exactly what this channel does. Hit subscribe and stick around. Most people, asked to picture African American DNA and European DNA, picture two clean boxes sitting side by side, sealed off from each other. It's an intuitive picture. It's also wrong. And by 2015, Bryc's team had genotyped enough people to prove that the assumption doesn't survive contact with actual data. Start with the average African American genome. 73.2% African, 24.0% European, and 0.8% Native American. A quarter European ancestry isn't a footnote or a rare outlier sitting at the edge of the distribution. It's the average, the center of the curve, present in the ordinary case rather than the exceptional one. Then look at the other side of the supposed boundary. The average self-identified European American genome in parts of the South carries African ancestry that is measurably, provably not zero. Put those two facts side by side, and the categories stop looking like biology. The two separate boxes the American racial system built turn out to be genetically overlapping populations, shaped by a shared and coercive history rather than by any clean genetic line. This wasn't a one-off result either, easy to dismiss as a quirk of one dataset or one lab. Cheng and colleagues ran a meta-analysis in 2009 pulling together 14 independent datasets, and the European component in African American genomes consistently landed in the 15 to 25% range across all of them. Different samples, different labs, different years. The same overlap kept showing up. The boxes were always social categories, built and enforced by law and custom, laid on top of a genome that never agreed to respect the line. Genetics doesn't care what a census form asks. It only records what actually happened between actual people, generation after generation, regardless of what anyone called it at the time. So where does that quarter European ancestry in the average African American genome actually come from, and who put it there? The number itself doesn't explain its own origin. It just sits there, waiting for the historical record to catch up to it and account for how it got that high, that consistently, across an entire population. The numbers, laid out directly, Bryc and her colleagues in 2015 worked with 5,269 self-described African Americans, 148,789 European Americans, and 8,663 Latinos, all customers of 23andMe, all run through high-density SNP arrays capable of resolving ancestry with real precision. This wasn't a small pilot study. It was one of the largest ancestry datasets of its kind ever assembled. The average African American ancestry breakdown came out to 73.2% African, 24.0% European, 0.8% Native American. But averages flatten individual stories, and the individual variation underneath that average is enormous. Some individuals in the dataset carried under 28% African ancestry and still identified, fully and consistently, as African American, a reminder that identity and ancestry are related but not identical measurements. A logistic regression run on the data showed that African ancestry percentage does significantly predict self-reported race. But the fit is imperfect. Identity and genetics diverge at the edges of the distribution, and those edges are where the cleanest stories about race break down fastest. Geographically, the pattern wasn't random. The highest African ancestry concentrations in self-identified African Americans showed up in South Carolina and Georgia. The lowest concentrations clustered in the Northeast, the Midwest, the Pacific Northwest, and California, regions with smaller historical enslaved populations. A geographic fingerprint left directly by the machinery of slavery itself. The study's own language for all of this is notably restrained. It frames the pattern as the legacy of historical interactions, a clinical, almost bureaucratic phrase standing in for a brutal history of coercion, ownership, and violence carried out across generations. That 24% European average sitting in the data didn't arrive through immigration paperwork. It didn't arrive through choice, courtship, or any of the ordinary channels through which populations usually mix. It arrived through something else entirely, something the numbers alone can gesture toward but can't fully explain on their own. The mechanism behind the numbers has a specific historical address. Research consistently dates the admixture window to before the Civil War, concentrated most heavily in the plantation South, the same geography that later showed up as the highest concentration states in the modern genetic data. This was the era of chattel slavery, a legal system in which enslaved women had no standing to refuse a white man, whether that man was their enslaver or someone else entirely. Refusal wasn't a right the law recognized. It wasn't a protection the courts extended. Legal historians and geneticists, working from entirely different disciplines, arrive at the same conclusion from different directions. This ancestry pattern is inseparable from the documented history of coerced sex under slavery. Not romance, not choice. Coercion, embedded directly into a legal system that made refusal impossible by design. The children born from these unions entered a legal framework built specifically to determine their status. Under the doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum, a child's condition followed the mother's, automatically enslaved if the mother was enslaved, regardless of who the father was or what status he held. It was law-engineered to strip fatherhood of any legal consequence for the child's freedom. That single legal mechanism explains something the raw percentages alone can't. Why European ancestry flowed into the African American gene pool so consistently, while the reverse pattern rarely worked the same way. The law made the direction of admixture structural, not incidental. Genetics, in this case, isn't just recording who descended from whom. It's recording the fingerprint of a specific legal machinery built for exploitation, still legible in DNA more than a century and a half later. And that legal asymmetry left a very specific fingerprint of its own, one that only becomes visible when the DNA is split apart by sex. A Philadelphia-based study set two lines of DNA against each other: mitochondrial DNA, passed down strictly through the maternal line, and Y-chromosome DNA, passed down strictly through the paternal line. The comparison, run in African Americans, produced two numbers that shouldn't have matched if the mixing had happened evenly in both directions. Only 9 to 10% of mtDNA lineages traced back to Europe, but 31% of Y-chromosome lineages traced to Europe, roughly triple the maternal figure. That gap is not a statistical curiosity. It's the genetic signature of one-directional coercion, the record of European men fathering children with enslaved black women, at rates far exceeding anything moving in the reverse direction. The maternal line stayed largely African. The paternal line did not. The same Philadelphia sample tested European Americans, and the pattern flipped almost entirely into its opposite. Non-European mtDNA showed up in under 7% of that population. Non-European Y-DNA showed up in under 2%. The near-total absence on both lines tells its own story. A population whose ancestry moved almost exclusively within itself, in sharp contrast to the population it was mixing into. This asymmetry isn't a Philadelphia quirk. It has been replicated across multiple U.S. admixture studies, in different cities, different samples, different research teams arriving at the same lopsided ratio. That consistency is what turns a single dataset into a structural pattern. something built into the history itself rather than an artifact of one city's demographics. Geneticists have a term for it: sex-biased admixture. It's a clinical phrase, flat and procedural, the kind of language built for a peer-reviewed methods section. But underneath the clinical term sits a history that is anything but clinical, a pattern of power moving in exactly one direction, generation after generation, recorded permanently in the sex chromosomes of millions of descendants who never chose it. The math on its own can feel abstract. 2 percentages sitting next to each other on a page. Triple the rate on one line, almost none on the other. But numbers like that rarely stay abstract for long once you follow them to an actual family, an actual name, an actual set of descendants who can be traced. One case turns that abstract math into a specific, documented person. In 1998, the journal Nature published findings from a team led by Dr. Eugene Foster, who had run Y-chromosome tests comparing male-line descendants of Field Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's uncle, against male-line descendants of Eston Hemings, the youngest son of Sally Hemings. The Y-chromosome, passed essentially unchanged from father to son across generations, gave the team a direct genetic thread to follow. The result was a match, a rare Y-chromosome haplotype shared between the two lines, a genetic signature not common enough to appear by coincidence in unrelated families. The same study also tested descendants of the Carr family, who had been blamed for generations by Jefferson's white descendants as the more socially acceptable explanation for Hemings' children. The Carr line showed no match at all, ruling that family out entirely and closing off the alternative explanation that had circulated for 200 years. The statistical odds of the Jefferson line matching the Hemings line by pure chance came out to less than 1 in 1,000. Sally Hemings had been enslaved by Jefferson since childhood, a legal and physical status that meant there was no scenario, none, in which she could have legally consented to anything involving him. Monticello's own research committee, made up of the institution's stewards, the people with every incentive toward caution rather than confirmation, formally accepted the DNA finding in 2000. By 2018, the same institution was describing the relationship as settled historical matter, no longer an open question. What makes the finding land differently than a typical genetics headline is the timeline underneath it. 2 of Hemings' children, Madison and Eston, had given oral histories describing exactly this relationship for over a century before any laboratory confirmed it. Their account waited 100 years for the science to catch up. A sitting president's DNA confirmed what an enslaved woman's descendants had been saying all along, and it took 2 centuries to run the test. From Monticello, the frame widens out to South Carolina and Georgia, the 2 states carrying the highest average African ancestry among self-identified African Americans anywhere in the Bryc dataset. These aren't arbitrary states. They were rice and cotton plantation strongholds, home to some of the largest enslaved populations in the entire history of the United States. South Carolina's case is especially stark. At points before the Civil War, its enslaved population actually outnumbered its free population, a demographic fact that reshapes how the modern genetic numbers should be read. This wasn't a state with a plantation economy on its margins. It was a state built, structurally and numerically, around slavery as its central economic engine. That economic entrenchment shows up directly in the genetic data generations later. Higher concentration of the historical enslaved population correlates directly with higher present-day African ancestry percentages in the region. Not a loose association, but a documented, statistically traceable relationship between where slavery was most intense and where its genetic legacy is most concentrated today. In effect, the genome is functioning as an unintentional historical record, marking out where slavery was most economically entrenched without anyone designing it to do so. Nobody encoded this information on purpose. It simply persisted, generation after generation, because the underlying demographic reality was severe enough to leave a lasting statistical signature. This isn't guesswork or loose correlation dressed up as science. It's a statistically documented relationship between historical plantation density and modern regional ancestry averages, holding up across the dataset rather than appearing in isolated pockets. Move south again, and a different mixing pattern shows up entirely. Louisiana breaks the simple 2-population story that defines so much of the plantation South. Spanish colonization arrived first, French settlement layered on top of it, and Caribbean migration folded in before and alongside the transatlantic slave trade. A sequence of overlapping populations that never resolved into the clean black-white binary seen elsewhere. The genetic record reflects that complexity directly. Louisiana shows one of the highest rates of hidden African ancestry among self-identified whites anywhere in the country, at roughly 12%, a figure that outpaces much of the rest of the region built on a simpler colonial history. It also carries something the rest of the plantation South largely doesn't, notably elevated Native American ancestry among self-identified European Americans, sitting around 8%. Geneticists trace part of that figure back to early Spanish contact with native populations, a layer of mixing that predates the plantation economy most of the region is defined by. Louisiana's Creole and Cajun populations carry this history in a particularly direct form, documented three-way admixture, African, European, and Native American, sitting together in the same lineages rather than split across separate communities. That's a genetic pattern distinct from almost anywhere else covered so far. The root cause of that complexity is straightforward. Louisiana functioned as a trading and cultural crossroads for far longer than most of the plantation South ever did, absorbing successive waves of contact rather than a single dominant colonial and economic system. Unlike South Carolina's more binary black-white history, built almost entirely around a single plantation economy, Louisiana's genome reflects genuine three-population convergence, three distinct ancestral streams meeting and mixing in the same families, over generations, in a way the rest of the region simply didn't produce. Head further west, and the mixing story changes again, this time with a forced march sitting at the center of it. Oklahoma carries the highest rate of Native American ancestry among self-identified African Americans of any state in the Bryc dataset, a distinct pattern from anything seen in the plantation South or in Louisiana. The reason traces directly back to the 1830s and the Trail of Tears, when Native nations were forced west into what became Oklahoma. Some of those nations traveled with enslaved black people they themselves held, while other enslaved and formerly enslaved black people later lived alongside them in that same territory, whether through captivity, escape, or resettlement. Several Native nations, including the Cherokee, held enslaved black people both prior to and after removal, a documented chapter of Cherokee history that remains debated and actively discussed within the nation itself today, not a settled or comfortable footnote. After the Civil War, treaties signed with several of the removed nations granted citizenship within those nations to formerly enslaved people, a group known as freedmen. That citizenship status remains legally contested in the present day, still working its way through tribal and federal courts generations later. Taken together, this means Oklahoma's genetic record reflects two forced migrations layering directly onto each other, rather than one clean historical event: the removal of native nations and the forced displacement of enslaved people, intersecting in the same territory, and eventually the same family lines. Genealogists researching Black Cherokee family lines run into this exact historical intersection constantly, tracing DNA matches that lead straight back to this specific and layered history rather than to any single, simple point of origin. Now flip the entire frame, because the story isn't only about what shows up in African American DNA. Turn the story around now, because the DNA record doesn't only flow in one direction through the historical narrative most people already know. Bryc's same 2015 dataset, the one that produced the African American ancestry averages, also contained a second finding that gets far less attention. Roughly 3.5 to 4% of self-identified European Americans nationally carry 1% or more African ancestry. That threshold isn't arbitrary. It corresponds to an African ancestor within roughly the last 6 generations, somewhere around 200 years back. Not a rounding error, not statistical noise. A documented ancestor sitting inside a range that overlaps with living family memory, close enough that oral history could theoretically still reach it, even where it didn't. What that percentage translates to in practice is thousands of families who have identified as white, and whose parents and grandparents identified as white before them, carrying a traceable, datable African ancestor inside their genome. This isn't distant, diffuse, prehistoric mixing. It's recent enough to have a rough date attached to it. The pattern isn't scattered randomly across the country either. It concentrates heavily in specific states, tracking the same plantation geography already established. The same regions where the historical record of slavery runs deepest show up again here, from a completely different data source. Genetic researchers link this directly to a historical phenomenon known as passing, where mixed ancestry individuals with lighter skin cross the color line into white identity. Sometimes that crossing was a single deliberate decision. Sometimes it unfolded gradually across generations, with descendants losing awareness of it entirely along the way. 23andMe's own 2024 research notes state the asymmetry plainly. African Americans are typically well aware of mixed ancestry within their family history, while white Americans carrying hidden African ancestry usually are not. The DNA passed down the same way in both cases. The knowledge of it didn't. The state-by-state numbers on this one get specific fast. South Carolina tops the list. At least 13% of self-identified whites there carry 1% or more African ancestry, the highest figure anywhere in the dataset. Louisiana follows close behind at just over 12%. Georgia and Alabama sit near each other as well, each landing at roughly 9%. Outside even these leading states, the pattern doesn't disappear. In parts of the broader South beyond South Carolina, Louisiana, Georgia, and Alabama, the rate still holds around 1 in 10. That's not a handful of isolated counties producing a statistical fluke. That's a regional pattern touching millions of people across an entire section of the country. The historical dating on this lines up precisely with everything already established. Roughly 6 generations back places these admixture events squarely inside the pre-Civil War plantation era. The same historical window covered by the Bryc percentages, the Jefferson-Hemings case, and the sex-biased admixture data. Harvard historian Henry Louis Gates Jr. wrote publicly about this exact research in The Root, connecting it directly to America's history of racial passing and to the one-drop rule, the doctrine that shaped how families across the South understood, or avoided understanding, their own ancestry. That one-drop rule is worth naming precisely, because it explains the incentive structure underneath all these numbers. It was the legal and social doctrine holding that any known African ancestry made a person legally black, regardless of how they looked or how many generations had passed. A doctrine like that doesn't encourage curiosity about family history. It creates enormous incentive across generations to conceal ancestry rather than investigate it. That concealment wasn't accidental. For many families, it was the only path to safety available to them. The one-drop rule wasn't some vague cultural attitude floating in the background. It operated in various legal forms across southern states well into the 20th century, with some versions codified into law as late as the 1920s and 1930s. This was recent, enforceable, documented legal machinery, not a distant relic. Under that system, a documented African ancestor could strip a person of legal whiteness entirely, with direct consequences for marriage rights, property ownership, and basic social standing. The stakes attached to ancestry weren't abstract. They touched nearly every legal dimension of a person's life. Given those stakes, some families with light-skinned, mixed ancestry members made a documented historical choice: sever contact with relatives who couldn't or wouldn't pass, and move permanently into white communities and white identity. This wasn't a rare, isolated occurrence confined to a few unusual cases. It happened often enough that genealogists and historians now treat these passing lines as a recognized, traceable category within American family history, with patterns researchers know to look for. DNA testing in the 2010s and 2020s began surfacing these buried lines involuntarily, sometimes decades after the original decision to conceal, sometimes centuries after it. A test taken for curiosity or a health screening could suddenly reopen a family decision made under the direct threat of the one-drop rule. The genetic record and the family record diverged for a specific reason: survival, not secrecy for its own sake. Families weren't hiding ancestry because they were ashamed in some vague sense. They were hiding it because the law made not hiding it dangerous. That context reframes the entire subject. The shocking finding running through all of this was never really about DNA sitting in a lab. It was about what people had to hide in order to survive, and how long that hiding managed to hold, sometimes for well over a century, before a genetic test broke it open. Zoom out now from individual families to what happened to the population as a whole once slavery itself had ended. Baharian and colleagues published their findings in PLOS Genetics in 2016, working from a study of 3,726 African Americans drawn from nationally and regionally representative cohorts across the United States. It's one of the more comprehensive datasets built specifically to trace ancestry and movement together. Their reconstruction of ancestor origins, prior to the transatlantic travel era mixing already covered, came out to 82.1% Africa, 16.7% Europe, and 1.2% the Americas. Those figures set the baseline the study then used to trace what happened next. The study's core finding centers on timing. The admixture itself happened predominantly before the Civil War, concentrated in the South, consistent with everything already documented across earlier segments. What the Baharian study adds is what happened afterward, during the Great Migration, the movement of roughly 6 million African Americans out of the rural South into northern, midwestern, and western cities between 1910 and 1970. That migration, despite moving millions of people across huge distances, didn't create new admixture. It redistributed the ancestry that already existed, carrying it out of the plantation South and scattering it across entirely new regions of the country. That single fact explains something that might otherwise look confusing on a map: why regional ancestry differences across the modern United States track so cleanly onto historical migration routes, rather than onto wherever the original mixing happened to occur. The ancestry moved with the people, not the mixing event itself. To reconstruct this, the study used relatedness data alongside straightforward ancestry data, allowing researchers to trace actual genetic relationships between distant, geographically scattered relatives and rebuild real migration patterns from those connections. In effect, the Great Migration is written into modern American genomes just as clearly as it's written into any census record from the period, a population movement legible directly in DNA a century later. Trace the ancestry back further, across the Atlantic itself, and a newer controversy shows up, this one running between scientists. Micheletti and colleagues published a large-scale study in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2020, mapping regional African origins for people of African descent across the Americas, drawing on more than 50,000 23andMe research participants for the analysis. The study's central finding pointed to Nigeria specifically. African ancestry among African Americans traced disproportionately back to Nigerian genetic lineages, more than to any other African region in the dataset. A formal rebuttal followed in the same journal in 2021, titled "So Many Nigerians," arguing that this apparent overrepresentation is likely an artifact of incomplete African reference databases, skewed by the outsized presence of Yoruba samples within existing genomic repositories, rather than a straightforward reflection of historical reality. The rebuttal also raised a separate problem. Colonial-era maps of Africa don't cleanly match the pre-colonial empires and kingdoms that actually supplied people into the transatlantic trade, which complicates any attempt to map modern national borders back onto historical origins. Micheletti's team published a formal response of their own, defending elements of the original analysis, while acknowledging the database limitations the rebuttal had identified. This remains a live, unresolved scientific disagreement, not a settled fact, and it's worth stating plainly, rather than picking a side in an argument that the researchers themselves haven't finished having. It's a reminder that even rigorous, peer-reviewed genetic history can carry real uncertainty baked directly into the reference data it depends on. Beyond ancestry maps, this same genetic data has started showing up somewhere far more personal than a research paper, inside people's actual medical charts. A pooled study looked at 15,280 African Americans drawn from 14 separate epidemiologic cohorts, using a technique called admixture mapping to search for genetic contributors to obesity. The approach compares disease rates against ancestry proportion at specific points along the genome, letting researchers isolate genetic effects that would otherwise get lost in a less mixed population. The result? A higher percentage of European ancestry was significantly correlated with lower BMI, a statistically significant finding with a p-value of 1.6 times 10^7, a number small enough to rule out chance as an explanation. That doesn't mean ancestry causes body weight in any simple, direct sense. It means specific gene variants, unevenly distributed across ancestry groups, interact with a trait that gets blamed almost entirely on diet and lifestyle in everyday conversation. The genetics sits underneath the lifestyle explanation, not instead of it. Admixture mapping built on this same logic has also been used to study diabetes risk, kidney disease, and prostate cancer disparities between African and European Americans, searching for the same kind of ancestry-linked genetic signal in each case. These studies exist, specifically and only, because the same historical admixture explored throughout this video created a uniquely useful population for finding disease-linked genes that are difficult to isolate in less mixed populations. The genetic diversity created by centuries of coerced mixing turned out to be scientifically valuable in a way nobody involved in that history could have anticipated. The tool built here to study identity and history turned out to carry direct clinical stakes for a specific, living population generations removed from the events that created the genetic pattern in the first place. None of this research, from the obesity correlation to the disease risk mapping, would be scientifically possible without the mixed ancestry created by centuries of a specific, coercive history. All of which leads back to the number this video opened on. Nothing in this video came from a leaked document or a suppressed study. Every figure covered here sits inside a peer-reviewed, publicly accessible journal, available to anyone willing to search for it. The framing of this material as too shocking to publish misunderstands what actually happened. The papers were published. They were cited by other researchers. They were even covered by outlets like Science and The Root, reaching audiences well beyond academic genetics. What stayed hidden was never the data itself. What stayed hidden was the knowledge, inside individual families, of what that data would eventually reveal about them personally. The concealment operated at the family level, passed down or withheld across generations, under direct legal and social pressure, not at the level of scientific institutions holding anything back. Millions of Americans, across both black and white self-identification, are walking around right now with an ancestry story their own family tree doesn't mention. The gap isn't in the science, it's in the family record. Consumer DNA testing since the early 2010s has been quietly, individually reopening those stories one saliva sample at a time, handing ordinary people information their own relatives never passed down, sometimes never even knew themselves. The science didn't create the secret sitting inside these families. It simply started handing people back pieces of a story that slavery, and the laws built specifically to enforce it, had spent centuries erasing from the record. Every number in this video traces back to a decision someone made, generations ago, that they never expected DNA to undo. Buried inside the Bryc 2015 dataset sits a small, easy-to-miss detail. About 2% of people who self-identified as African American showed less than 2% African ancestry, a figure far below the population norm established everywhere else in the study. Of that small group, 88% turned out to carry predominantly European ancestry instead, with a smaller remaining share showing East Asian, South Asian, or Southeast Asian ancestry. It's an unusual cluster, sitting well outside the pattern the rest of the dataset had established. The researchers themselves didn't treat this as evidence of some hidden subpopulation worth building a theory around. They attributed it to survey error, reasoning that even a tiny 0.02% mistake rate across a database containing hundreds of thousands of entries would produce exactly this many outliers on its own, without any deeper explanation required. It's a rare moment where geneticists explicitly flag their own data as probably wrong, rather than reaching for a more dramatic explanation that might have made for a more interesting headline. That kind of self-correction is unusual to see stated so plainly inside a published paper, and it's part of what makes the rest of the dataset credible in the first place. Researchers willing to name their own likely errors are researchers worth trusting on the numbers they do stand behind. It's a small detail in the scope of everything else covered here, but it matters for how seriously to take the bigger numbers surrounding it. The caution shown in this one paragraph of the paper is a sign of rigor, not weakness. Real science includes acknowledging its own noise, even when a cleaner, tidier story would have made for better headlines and easier viral summaries. Which is worth sitting with, heading into the last question this data actually raises. Every number in this video sat inside a public, peer-reviewed journal for years before most people ever heard about it, filed away in academic archives while the story it told went almost entirely unnoticed outside genetics itself. The story isn't really about percentages, not at its core. It's about how legal systems, coercion, and survival strategies get written directly into DNA without anyone ever intending them to be, encoded permanently into something that outlasts every document, every land deed, every official record from the era that created it. Millions of self-identified African Americans carry European ancestry rooted in slavery-era coercion, not choice, a genetic inheritance shaped by a legal system that made refusal impossible. Thousands of self-identified white American families carry African ancestry, their own family stories never passed down, sometimes deliberately concealed for the sake of safety, sometimes simply lost across enough generations that no one alive remembers it happened. Genetics can now surface all of it, pulling threads out of the historical record that no document, no oral history, and no family Bible ever recorded on its own. But genetics can't tell anyone what to do with that knowledge once it actually arrives on a screen, once a percentage turns into a question about who someone's ancestors actually were. If your own DNA quietly disagreed with the story your family always told you, Would you actually want to know? That's the question this data leaves sitting with you, long after the test results load.